The first step for this jet bike is to apply a white zenithal highlight using Media Com Art Opaque White. Because of the way I modeled this jet bike to be banking on its base, I wanted to make sure that my highlights here match the general theme of the model, where the highest highlights, or the brightest whites, match up to the topmost points of the model as it sits on its base. I also carried over this same highlighting theory onto the rider itself, to ensure that even though the rider and the jet bike were painted separately, the highlights looked the same and it appeared there was a single light source hitting both of them together. To begin building up my red coloration, I start off by applying 2 thin layers of Scale 75 Deep Red over the entire model. I do 2 layers here because, well, I actually thinned down the paint a little bit too much for the first pass, but you want to make sure you have a pretty good solid coloration where you have a nice vibrant red color to start with. I then go back and airbrush on another highlight using the Media Com Air Opaque White over the same parts that were the brightest before I applied the deep red. I reapply this pure white highlight here, as I find it makes the next step a lot easier to do than trying to build up a bright red color over the deep red, as you have this bright base coat to build off of and help boost the vibrancy of your next color. After I'm happy with my second round of highlights, I mix up my next red color by adding some Antares Red, a little bit of thinner, and a drop of crimson ink into my airbrush paint cup. I add the crimson ink here as I'm trying to increase the saturation or intensity of my Antares Red. This red mixture is then applied evenly all over the entire model. Because I added enough thinner so that the paint is semi-transparent, all of the highlights and shadows we have from the previous steps will still show through, so you almost have a naturally highlighted model after applying this step, even though you're applying this evenly over the entire model. Even after the last layer of Antares Red and crimson ink, the red wasn't quite vibrant enough for my tastes, so I decided to do one more layer of a thinned down crimson ink over the entire model. I don't really measure the exact quantity of thinner to ink I use, but I hope this video kind of shows you that I use about a drop of ink to, I don't know, half of an airbrush cup worth of thinner. This thinned down ink mixture is then sprayed across the entire model to boost the color to get a deeper red and make it just a little bit more visually interesting. Now that I'm done with the red on the model, I move on to the iconic black stripes over the jet bike's cowling. First though, in order to make sure I don't accidentally scratch or remove any of the underlying red paint, I spray on a layer of thinned down gloss varnish. After the gloss varnish had dried, I used a couple different types of Timmy masking tape to mask off the negative areas where I didn't want to apply my black stripes to. For this model, my plan was to have one broad stripe on top and a narrow stripe underneath, so I started off by masking off the top portion of the broad stripe, followed by using a thin piece of tape for the bottom portion of the broad stripe, and then you use some more thicker tape to mask off the kind of bottom edge of that narrow stripe. It's important to take your time here and make sure your masking tape looks exactly correct, as it's really hard to fix any errors you have later on. And one place you need to pay particular attention to is at the very tips of the stripes, where the masking tape overlaps, and it's really easy to have one of the pieces of masking tape hang over the edge slightly and give you a ragged look to your model. I then tape off the rest of the cowling to ensure that no overspray gets anywhere else on the model. To actually paint the black, all I do is start by spraying a thin layer of flat black over the entire area where I want the stripes to be. I then add a bit of bearing blue into that flat black mixture and spray highlights across the cowling on the stripes in line with the rest of the highlights from before. Finally, I carefully remove all the masking tape to reveal the nice crisp stripes that I have made. For the next step, I apply a single decal on the hood of the jet bike, and I make sure I get it pretty much aligned right in the center here where I want it to go. I next apply a thin layer of microsol over the entire transfer, as it helps soften the decal up and blends the edges into the armor a little bit better. One thing I'll note here for anyone who hasn't used microsol before is that it's pretty important to dab up any extra microsol that's sitting on the model, as you don't want it to pool. There's a chance here it could actually discolor the paint underneath it or even peel away some of the paint, which is why you always want to dab it up with a paper towel. I then wait about an hour for the decal to fully dry before spraying the model again with a layer of gloss varnish to ensure that the decal is locked in and doesn't get accidentally rubbed off later on. In order to add a little more definition and shading to the model, I next turn to a black oil wash. I use a pre-mixed mixture that I already have saved up from my last time I did this, but if you want to make your own, all you have to do is mix a little bit of lamp black oil paint with some odorless mineral spirits. Because I don't want to stain the red of the jet bike too much with this oil wash, I try to carefully apply it only in the very recesses where I'm trying to shade. One of the cool things about oil washers though is that because they have a pretty low surface tension, they'll actually flow into the recesses pretty easily, as you can see here on the armor plates of the Guardian. After I'm happy with the shading from the oil wash, and I've given enough time for the oil to dry, I spray the entire model with AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish to 1. Lock all the oils in, and 2. Kill all the shine from the previous gloss varnish layers. I personally really appreciate the, ultra matte look that this varnish gives, and would highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. Now that the red of the model is done, I can move on to the other colors, and I start with the helmet next. White is known as a fairly tricky color to paint, and it's rather challenging to properly shade it or highlight it so it still reads as white but has nice shadows and volumes. My process is fairly straightforward though, and I start by applying a layer of bearing blue over my white zenithal highlighted base coat. Next I turn to Media Calm Art Opaque White again and spray the model from a very extreme top-down angle. Because of the way the airbrush works, where it sprays paint directly in a straight line from the nozzle obviously, by spraying at this extreme angle, I can force in certain shades and ensure that the paint is only really hitting the topmost parts of the model when viewed from the same angle that I'm spraying at. When determining the angle of spray you're going to use for your model though, make sure you consider how the helmet will sit on the finished model and the highlights you're applying are consistent with the overall highlights on the model. For example here, I knew the helmet would be slightly turned, so instead of doing a pure top-down zenithal highlight, I thought through how the helmet would look when turned on the finished model and sprayed at that angle. To finish off the helmet, I next paint the entire faceplate with flat black and highlight the edges underneath the eyes with bearing blue. I actually find it very difficult to paint Eldar eyes, and it's even harder to do when there's a camera in front of my face, so for this model I did a fairly straightforward process where I painted the bottom quarter of the eye with a Roddy green and added a small dot of pure white into both the top and bottom corners of the eye. Moving on to the metallic parts of the model next, I start by applying a base coat of Scale 75 Heavy Metal, and apply a wash of Games Workshop Druchii Violet. I use this purple shade here as I think it gives a very interesting and unique alien vibe to the metals on this model, which is different enough from the very generic metallic recipes you see that involve just washing your silvers with either Agrax Earthshade or Nuln Oil. Once the shade is dried, I layer heavy metal back over all the metallic areas again and leave the purple just in the recesses. For the last step of the metallic silver parts, I mix up some abyssal blue with a lot of thinner to get a very thin glaze that I use to deepen the shadows on the silver areas. As I said, this glaze is fairly thin and does two things here. The first is that because the Scale 75 paint's a little bit matte, it actually dulls down the silver so you get a bright luster on only the highest points that we left pure heavy metal. Secondly, it adds some more color contrast to the model, which helps to add more definition and make the brighter silver highlights really pop. I wanted to add a little more contrast to the model, so I decided to paint all of the screens and controls green. I started off by painting all of the controls and screens with black, then painted the bottom half of them with Boreal Tree green and the bottom quarter with a Roddy green. This is a pretty easy process, but gives a nice green pop to the model that contrasts nicely with the red. For the final step of the model itself, I painted all of the parts I wanted to be black with flat black and then edge highlighted them with bearing blue. To finish the model off, I move on to painting the base. While I'm not going to show the exact steps I used to make this base, I documented them in another video, which you can watch here in the upper right hand corner. I start off by layering on petroleum gray over the entire base, which is a kind of interesting brown gray color that works really well for the frozen tundra look I'm going for. I then dry brush over that rainy gray and Nakar from Scale 75. To get the snow on the base, I use a product from Tamiya called Powdered Snow Effect, which you can find on Amazon, and I'll throw a link down in the description below. But all I really do here is use a sculpting tool to pile up the snow effect all around the base, and to work it into the nooks and crannies on the Iraqi spires. Finally, I finish up the model by painting the rim of the base black. If you liked this tutorial, please don't forget to hit that like button, as it helps YouTube to know that this video is worth spreading to a larger audience, which in turn means I get more views and more subscribers, and seeing those numbers tick up in YouTube Studio releases that sweet, sweet dopamine hit that my brain requires to keep on being motivated to put out more videos. Also, I've had some people suggest that I put up a Discord server as a place for like-minded hobbyists to hang out and ask questions about how to paint with an airbrush and using the techniques that I've shown off in these videos. If this is something you think you'd be interested in, please let me know in the comments below, as if there's enough people to do so, I'll get it set up in the next couple of weeks. And finally, before I end this video, I just want to let y'all know that if you're interested in more Eldar tutorial content, I have this video right here on how to paint an Yandin Wraithlord that I think you'll find very interesting. As always, thanks for watching, and hobby on.